We are still waiting for Professor Osman to join us. I've sent him a message already. Inshallah, he'll join us soon. Please, Professor Osman, please, yeah, okay, unmute yourself. All right.
Hello.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm very
Okay.
sorry. There's some technical
Okay.
problem.
Okay. You just need to make your camera a little bit down. Okay. No. Now, little down. Okay. That's yeah. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. Okay. Alhamdulillah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. So, shall we begin?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's all right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to everyone from ISTAC, International Institute of Islamic Thought, International Islamic University, Malaysia. We are honored to have Professor Usman once again here with us today. This is our third lecture in the series of community engagement lectures. And we have a very interesting topic today. The topic is jihad, which excites everybody, especially in the West. You know, when they hear the word jihad, they're always excited to know what is it all about. And no matter how much we discuss it, the answers still remain. The question, their answer, they find our answers not satisfactory. Besides jihad, they're also interested about the question of women in Islam, but maybe that could be a topic for the next time. So today, our topic is Islam as a way of obedience and jihad. So I welcome Professor Emeritus, Professor Datuk, Dr. Osman Bakar, to begin his talk this afternoon. Bismillah.
Bismillah. Thank you, Professor Imtiaz, for moderating this program. And well, good afternoon, and those in other different places, good day, wherever you are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And peace be to you all. Islam as a religion may be looked at, may be viewed, may be approached from different angles. In the first lecture, I talked about Islam as a way of knowledge. In other words, I was looking at the religion of Islam from the perspective of knowledge. First, just highlights of the topic because it was very broad. In the second lecture, the previous lecture, I approached Islam from the perspective of love. And I mentioned, or I gave the title, Islam as a way of love. Today, I'm approaching Islam from the perspective of obedience, which is quite closely related to jihad. In fact, in the course of explaining what the position or the Islam's view on obedience, in that process, I will also be referring to a jihad, although I will be more substantially towards the end of this, the latter half of this lecture on the meaning and significance of jihad. Let's first deal with the question of obedience. Now, before I go to the verses, the relevant verses of the Quran on obedience, allow me to philosophize a little bit about obedience, in the sense that I'm providing you first with the kind of philosophy of obedience. Now, the English word is obedience. What I'm referring to, of course, in English, this is obedience, but in Arabic, it is ta'at, and of course from the Malay ta'at. Yeah, the Malay ta'at is from that ta'at, and it is this subject now. Let me begin my philosophical statements on obedience this way. Obedience is a human attribute and quality. Obedience is human attribute and quality. It is an integral component of human nature. In saying this, I'm therefore letting you know that we are now in the very interesting field of discourse, which I may refer to as psychology of obedience. Right? That's the first thing to say. Psychology of obedience. Man was born with the potentiality to develop his attribute and quality of obedience to the fullest extent possible. Man is naturally endowed with the capacity to obey something or to obey someone or some authority. Being naturally endowed, the attribute of obedience is to be part of a person's constitution or character throughout his life. The sense of obedience cannot be removed from a person. It cannot be removed from a person's psyche or consciousness. It is a lasting imprint on the soul. It is a lasting imprint on the soul. But how the imprint would look like, if we can see, if only we can see, we can visualize how the imprint of obedience on the soul will look like as we individually traverse the path of our life on earth. That would very much depend on how we have shaped our own psychological history of obedience. Let me repeat, how we have shaped our own psychological history of obedience. And it is important to emphasize that man has the freedom to shape his own psychological history of obedience, which I'll say a little more later. Now, obedience is not only a psychological issue, but also a social issue. It is also a political issue. But most important of all, obedience is a religious issue. Right? Let's say a little bit more about obedience as a psychological issue. As a psychological issue, we are fundamentally interested in knowing which should be better for our character, or the state of our soul, or the state of the mind. Is it to have more or to have less obedience in our life? What are the motives of obedience? And what is the state of our mind when we perform a particular act of obedience? In particular, if you are a scientist, you are a neuroscientist, neurologist, in particular, what are our neurological conditions when we perform something as an act of obedience? Nowadays, science interested in testing, verifying what religion is saying. So this is an example. Okay, I want to find out, you are so obedient, let me do some scientific experiment on you. I want to know how your brain should work and function at the very time you perform your obedient act. These are some of the key questions that we may ask about obedience when we are looking at it from the perspective of psychology. Okay, little that something for reflection. Now, as a social issue, fundamentally, as an example, we want to know if nurturing obedience through education, whether at home or in schools, would help deliver discipline, creative thinking, and good moral character among students and youth. Today, who will be the leaders of tomorrow, the backbone of society? Now, we spend a lot of money and effort and time on education, but are we happy with the current way, with the way that we are nurturing obedience through education? To put it another way, does obedience improve or impair the overall quality of education? It's another question to think about. As a political issue, this is even more important. As a political issue, we want to know to what extent makes a difference to the quality of the relationship between leaders and followers, between the rulers and the ruled, or between the government and citizens, or between authorities and their subordinates. You can look at from in different contexts, but the point is, where does obedience play its role as far as in politics is concerned? Because we know very well, leaders expect obedience, governments expect obedience from citizens, but what are the conditions for that obedience? But obedience from the perspective of the religion of Islam is from the religious issue. Of course, it's important to emphasize that Islam understands religion in a quite different, in much broader way than what some religions present. In other words, religion comprehends the whole gamut of life. So from the perspective of religion of Islam, of course, the issue of obedience is a very, very comprehensive one that embraces many dimensions, including the psychological dimension, still under religious, or the social and the political. In other words, Islam has something meaningful and significant to say about each of these dimensions as far as the subject of obedience is concerned. In fact, Islamic teachings on obedience are substantial enough to permit us to speak of Islamic perspectives on psychology of obedience, perspectives on the sociology or educational theory of obedience, perspectives on politics of obedience, and the religious and spiritual significance of obedience. All these perspectives and theories combined would give us what I call Islamic philosophy of obedience, or equivalently, Islamic theology of obedience. It is therefore not surprising that in Islamic intellectual history, the subject of obedience has been discussed to considerable length in various sciences, including psychology, both spiritual psychology and scientific psychology, in the social science, in political science, and science of jurisprudence, fiqh, and science of principles of jurisprudence, usul fiqh. The subject has been discussed. Now, it is this philosophy of obedience that I mean in this comprehensive sense that is capable of answering in a total and integral manner the question, why is a human being capable of obedience? I repeat, why is a human being capable of obedience? The answer, of course, apart from the answers given by the different branches of science, and I think the most significant of all is Islam's answer metaphysically and theologically. Islam's metaphysical and theological answer to this question, why is human being capable of obedience? Why does human being have the capacity to have obedience? Now, I will try to answer by saying this, by this way, all right? Basically, is how I would formulate the answer. When God created us as human beings who are endowed with the divine template or pattern, what I mean by the divine template or pattern, I'm referring to the Quran. In the Quran, we have fitratullah. Fitratullah, because that is fitratullah, because in terms of the context, the verb, but basically is in Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, chapter 30, verse 30. 30, very nice. Chapter 30, verse 30, where it's reference to God has made the whole of mankind according to this pattern, the pattern in which God has created mankind, which the Quran refers to as fitratullah, which I express as the divine template or pattern of humanness. The pattern that defines in principle their humanness. So that pattern of humanness is contained in that fitratullah or the divine template or pattern. Now, what God has done, God implanted the seeds of obedience. You see, the seeds of obedience. When I use the word seeds, it means in potentiality, obedience in potentiality, potential obedience that's not yet actualized. Now, he implanted the seeds of obedience in this template, so that when everyone is born, he or she is born with that template, the seeds of obedience there. But God wants these seeds to be actualized. God wants these seeds to become actualized in each human person in the form of real quality of obedience. Now, there are many factors that influence the actualization, the process of actualization of this obedience. Of course, the most important is education. After all, the Prophet ﷺ said that every person is born in a state of fitrah. It is his parents that will make him a Jew or a Christian. In other words, education. Early education, such as the one given by parents or guardians, plays the most important contributory role in shaping the quality of obedience in a person. God wants obedience in potentiality to become obedience in actuality. Why? Because he wants to be obeyed. And why does he want to be obeyed? He wants to be obeyed for many reasons, in accordance with wisdom. Now, in God's plan, man cannot achieve the whole purpose of his existence, the whole purpose of his creation, unless the quality of obedience forms an integral part of his humanness. You remove that element called obedience, he's not a full man, he's not a full human being. He lost a great chunk of his humanness or humanness. So this is an important thing. However, although human obedience is one of God's purposes, he does not always get it. He does not always get it. Instead, he gets disobedience all the time from some people, and sometimes obedience from certain people. The possibility of disobeying God is due to the fact that man has been created with free will, which means the freedom to disobey. Yes, man has the freedom to obey. Why also the freedom? To disobey. And there lies the whole mystery of the human condition, or the human condition. Disobedience is human prerogative, right? Disobedience is human prerogative. Yeah, that privilege, is not enjoyed by other creatures. Man alone, the human species alone can disobey. All the other creatures cannot disobey. If I want to use the Islamic terminology, every creature is a perfect Muslim in the sense that that creature submits to God's will, the perfection. But human submission is imperfect, because sometimes he disobeys God's will. But of course, this is the meaning of human freedom. Man can taste that freedom. Can taste. I do not want to say that man can enjoy that freedom. Why? Because actually, if we disobey, it won't be an enjoyment. Man has to bear the great risk of disobedience. The great risk of disobedience. Now, to say that disobedience is a human prerogative is not to say that disobedience is more fundamental or more primary than obedience. I'm just wondering if by saying that I'll get a response from some naughty philosophy student. A naughty philosophy student say, yes, professor, if disobedience is a human prerogative, that means, is that as fundamental as obedience? Well, no, it's not so. I mean, it is not. Yeah? Disobedience is less fundamental, less primary than obedience. Obedience is more fundamental. In other words, obedience comes prior to disobedience. It's like belief and disbelief. No, it's not saying belief first. Belief comes first, then only disbelief. Yeah. So the epistemological status of belief is prior to disbelief, and that of obedience is prior to disobedience. Disobedience, as I said in a philosophical way, disobedience is just an act of changing one form of obedience to another. Disobedience, in reality, disobedience is just an act of changing one form of obedience to another. You change from disobedience to God, you change that to obedience to some other authority other than God, to some other object other than God. Yeah? So what this means is that objects of obedience can change, but the act of obedience remains the same. In other words, God planted obedience in the human being to serve as an instrument, namely to whatever it is, God, of course, God wants us to use this obedience as an act of instrument to attain the objectives of life as God has prescribed. That is the first. So God provides religion because religion will fill the content of this form, this vehicle called obedience. You may obey some authority which is not approved by God, all right? Which is in fact hated by God. So the question now is, obedience to whom? That is the question. And man and human beings have the freedom to choose the object of obedience. But as far as God is concerned, He provides the religion, and religion provides all the ways, all the instances, all the different contexts in which human beings can exercise obedience in accordance with God's will. So that is, that's my philosophical statement, specific introduction to this topic of obedience. Food for thought. I hope, it sounds logical enough to you all. But having said that, I would like to go to the different types of obedience, because my main interest here in this lecture is to emphasize this idea of enlightened obedience. Right? Enlightened obedience. Well, if people say obedience is bad, obedience is negative, of course, what they mean, they're referring to certain kind of obedience, but as far as Islam is concerned, Islam settles nothing less than enlightened obedience. I think, as I see it, there are three types of obedience. Three types of obedience. Number one, what I would call ignorant obedience. Number two, hypocritical obedience. Number three, enlightened obedience. I'll just touch briefly each of these. First, ignorant obedience. Of course, as you suspect, what is this ignorant obedience? It means that the obedience is not knowledge-based. It's not knowledge-based, or it lacks knowledge. Obedience does demand knowledge, but somehow, for some people, their act of obedience is not really based upon knowledge, the relevant knowledge, as in a sense that is the one that is relevant to the particular act of obedience. Now, but this ignorant obedience itself can be divided into two types. First, the first kind of ignorant obedience is what I call the innocent obedience. Right? For example, I'm referring to, say, a small child's obedience to parents, having got knowledge that, in other words, the child follow the command, follow the instruction given by the parent and follow, all right? The child has no knowledge does not understand really the significance of that instruction, but still do it, all right? And I call that the innocent children's obedience to parents. But innocence here is not innocence as applied to obedience does not apply only to children. Yeah? There is for adults. Of course, a good example in Islamic context, that applies also to the other religions, spiritual tradition. For example, the relations between disciples and their spiritual leaders, and prophets. In other words, sometimes the followers are asked by the guru, by the teacher, by the son, without the followers really understanding or knowing what is the reason behind all that, yeah. But because of their true faith, because of their strong faith in the integrity of their leader, for example, then they follow. But in other words, in the case of followers and the prophets ask the followers to do things, and we do that without every time knowing what is the wisdom. In other words, the wisdom is acquired gradually. In other words, and in the beginning, maybe we don't really understand, but we do it. But because it comes, because the instruction comes from the prophet who knows all the wisdom of that obedience, we do it. And this is what it meant, the beginning of obedience, or rather, the obedience is the beginning of wisdom. Let me say, a paraphrase of the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, yes, fear sometimes is good. It leads to something that is good. So it's the same thing with this obedience, let's call the innocent obedience. Now, the other type of ignorant obedience is what we have heard this kind of popular saying, blind obedience. Blind obedience is not necessarily, is different from ignorant obedience. So we see a lot of this blind obedience. So we don't apply blind obedience to children. We apply the word to adults. To adults who, although they become older and older, but never bother to add their knowledge to understand the meaning of obedience. Just follow, they'll say, follow the crowd. This is called follow the crowd. Now, the second kind of obedience is the hypocritical obedience. This kind of obedience is lacking in sincerity. Sincerity is very important, even in matters related to obedience. Sincerity. Now, this kind of obedience is both negative. It is negative and destructive. This is rampant in the, I will say, this is rampant in politics. This is rampant in political life. In politics, is particularly, of course, not exclusively, but it is rampant. It is rampant today, to the point of becoming a social disease. I'm afraid that this hypocritical obedience has become a kind of social cancer, cancerous to society. Something needs to be done. Now, of course, the third, and which is important here, the enlightened obedience. It is the knowledge-based obedience. This knowledge-based or this enlightened obedience is, first of all, characterized by sincere intention, which is based on knowledge. In other words, that intention is the quality of the intention is based upon knowledge. Two people may have the same intention, but it does not mean that the quality of intention in the two cases is the same. What makes a difference? Knowledge. So knowledge is the added value. Knowledge, it is knowledge that makes one's intention better or worse than another. I think that that should be obvious. All right. Now, in the Islamic context, of course, enlightened obedience, it should be based on obedience to God and obedience to His Prophet. Obedience to God and obedience to His Prophet. And as we shall see, I will be quoting a number of verses and a different context in which what those verses mean. But the point is, this is obedience based on obedience to God and to Prophet. And of course, the Prophet himself exercises obedience or performs obedience to God. Now, the other third feature of this enlightened obedience, which is quite interesting, which is reflected in the structure of the Arabic language itself. You know, you know that in Arabic, that is the root word. This term, the three-letter root verbs, right? So in the case of disobedience is from the three-letter word or, wow, ein, yeah? And you have or, alif, ein, right? And tawa'an, ta'an. So this from this root verbs we can derive many words. Now, what's interesting is that in the verb, in the fifth form of this verb, yeah, atawa'an, which interestingly conveys the meaning of voluntarism. Voluntarism, in other words, performing things willingly, not because under compulsion. So, enlightened obedience is one in which a person does not perform out of compulsion, but in other words, it's a willingly. He does that. He obeys willingly. He exercises his freedom and in the correct way. All right. So this is that particular form, word form, of in Arabic. It gives the meaning of voluntarism. And of course, that's what enlightened obedience is all about. Enlightened obedience is in a sense, we do it voluntarily. We do it willingly, based on knowledge. We know. Why do we obey? Because we know that thing is good, or that object of obedience is the one who should be obeyed. Now, so this is exercise of freedom in the true sense. If I may add, in enlightened obedience, we see the convergence of human will and God's will. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of enlightened obedience. Why? In enlightened obedience, there is convergence of human will and God's will. He is truly free who wills in accordance with God's will. Very, very profound thing. Huh? Something to reflect on. So anyway, for enlightened obedience, what does it mean? This is good. That obedience is good for the one who obeys. It is good for the one who is obeyed, and good also for others. So enlightened obedience guarantees the quality, the best quality of human action. So, and this is quite different from, say, the ignorant obedience, and one more when compared to hypocritical obedience. Now, let's look at obedience in the Quran. In the Quran, the root verb, in other words, words based on that root verb, tawa'a or ta'a, 120 times mentioned in the Quran. So, a lot. Yeah? So, those who want to study in detail the philosophy, the Quranic philosophy of obedience, I would suggest, I would advise, please go to this 129 context in which the obedience appears. But basically, the root word conveys the meanings of to obey, to comply, to submit, and in the case of the fifth form, to volunteer. Now, but most of the time, in the Quran, out of that 129 times, 72 times occur in the form of the fourth word form. This is the other form, the atwa'an, which means to obey, to follow, to be obedient, to submit, to yield, to comply, and to accede to someone's wishes. All these meanings are conveyed by the fourth form, this atwa'an. Now, we find in the Quran, obedience is talked about in two contexts. First, when obedience is virtue, as opposed to the other context, when obedience becomes a vice. It's logical because obedience is not, it's not something absolute here. In other words, it depends on the object of obedience or how the obedience is performed. So when obedience is a virtue, I may give a few examples and to show the different context in which obedience is enjoined and why obedience is very, it's important thing. First, I refer to chapter 4 and Nisa, chapter 4, verse 59. Let me read the translation. O you who believe, obey Allah, obey the messenger, and those charged with authority among you. Ati Allah, wa ati Rasul, wa ati Rasul, wa ulil amri minkum, wa ulil amri minkum. Those charged with authority among you. Now, this is a popular verse also, again, with some people, people who want to exact the obedience, especially from leaders who want, who want to get a kind of to be followed by to be obeyed by their followers. So people will quote this verse, say that obey Allah, obey the messenger, and obey those charged with authority, particularly political authority. But actually, ulil amri minkum, the ulil amri, it means those charged with authority, those who possess the authority from among you, minkum, from among you, from those who follow God and those who follow the prophet, obey the prophet, the messenger. Now, if you differ, the verse goes on, if you differ in anything among yourselves, refer it to God and his messenger. If you do believe in God and the last day, that is best, that is best, and the most excellent decision, ahsanu ta'wilan, the most excellent decision. That is the translation of that verse from chapter 4, verse 59. That's clear. The command, the Quran, and the commands the believers to obey God, to obey the messenger, and also to be charged and to obey those who are charged with authority, those who are charged with looking after the affairs of the followers of the subjects. Now, but then the verse makes it very clear. If you differ in anything, so there's bound to be issues on which there will be difference. So the advice, or rather the command to the believers, is to refer to Allah, which means to refer to the Quran, to refer to his messenger, refer to his sunnah, if we believe in God and the last day. Now, it is very interesting that the Quran says that will be the most excellent decision or the most excellent interpretation. Now, what this verse is telling us, there's no contradiction between obedience to God and obedience to the Prophet. All right? There's no contradiction between obedience to God and obedience to the Prophet. Obedience, as far as obedience to human authority, other than the Prophet, it is based on obedience to God and to the Prophet. It comes third, after obedience to God, after obedience to the Prophet, then only obedience to human authority. Right? Now, God's safeguard, God provided safeguard, because in giving this authority, in enjoining obedience to human authority, there's always the possibility that this will be abused and misused. So what sort of safeguard God provides? against this misuse and abuse? Well, the human authority itself must bear in mind that it itself has to be subjected to this rule, obedience to God and obedience to Prophet. So while the authority asks for obedience from those below, but they themselves must show obedience to authority above, namely God and a Prophet. So the obedience, enjoyment of obedience to human authority cannot be a blank check. It cannot be blank check. Yeah, it cannot be a blank check given to human authority. It is conditional. It is reciprocal in terms of commitment. Now, I just want to take this opportunity in the course of preparing this lecture. Okay, the word is ulil amri minkum. Nowadays, you talk a lot about also Islamic democracy. So I would say that this verse is significant, is relevant to the issue of democracy in Islam, right? In other words, the domain of authority, because in a sense, in principle, the authority of God, the authority of the messenger is beyond dispute, but then in terms of human authority, there could be dispute between the authority and those who are the subjects, the citizenry. Now, there's another word, there's another phrase which is related to ulil amri, which is well, either sometimes mentioned as ulul halli wal aqdi or ahlul halli wal aqdi. Literally, the ahlul halli wal aqdi, it means experts in untying and binding. You see that solving and binding, meaning is referring to the best brains in society who are given who are entrusted with leadership. In other words, the people, let's say in the modern context, the people who are in parliament, the members of parliament, they are supposed to be the question there, whether to fulfill the criteria imposed by the Islamic conception of that, and that's another matter. But the point is, these ahlul halli wal aqdi people who are good at untying. Now, there is a problem. This is the problem, right? And then you untie that problem. And then when you untie, you, in a sense, unpack. In other words, you have to finding the solution. The solution is sealed. It's bound. So in Malay, it's hurai dan simple. Very nice in Malay, hurai dan simple. Yeah? Problem. And the problem is always regarded as the masalah tersimpul. Masalah tersimpul. Satu simple. Yang tersimpul, then how to untie how to solve that, is called that, and to bind that. This is in the course of talking about obedience and how this issue is not unrelated. Now, the second verse, there are many verses, but I just chose what I have selected a few. I'm referring to chapter 3, Al-Imran, verse 132. Now, the translation of the verse, and obey Allah and the Messenger, that you may obtain mercy. Turhamun, that you may obtain mercy. See that? In other words, obedience to God, obedience to the Messenger will lead to something called mercy, that you may obtain mercy. obedience is going to lead to something, either that you can expect or you may not expect. But of course, mercy is a very, very all-embracing thing. It's better than anything else, because once you obtain mercy, the rest are, I mean, just parts of that. Specific examples of that mercy. So, in other words, the wisdom, one of the aspects of this divine wisdom in why he enjoined obedience to God and to the Prophet is so that we get mercy. In other words, obedience becomes a channel of grace and mercy and compassion. So God's grace, compassion, and mercy will flow through many channels. There are many channels of divine grace, not one, not two, many, many, and many. And so obedience is not for nothing. Through performing obedience, we are opening the channel of mercy, the channel of God's mercy. Please. Next, we refer to verse, again, chapter 4, and Nisa, this is verse 69. All, this is the translation of the verse. All who obey Allah and the Messenger are in the company of those on whom is the grace of Allah. الذين أنعم الله عليهم. In other words, the company on whom is grace of Allah. So the Quran, the rest of the verses with this company, the Quran speaks of this company, spiritual company. Who are in this company? The company who receive the grace of Allah, the prophets and Nabiyyin, the sincere and the truthful, as-siddiqin, the witnesses who testify, as-shuhada, the righteous who do good, as-salihin. 4 important groups mentioned. And then the verse concludes, what a beautiful fellowship. What a beautiful fellowship. In other words, now, obedience to Allah, obedience to Messenger is to lead us to be in this beautiful fellowship, comprising the prophets, the sincere and the truthful, the witnesses who testify, and the righteous. And Nabiyyin, as-siddiqin, as-shuhada, and as-salihin. We always pray to belong to one of these, right? To these fundamental spiritual groups. Now, a little more example. I think what's the time now, Prof? I think we'll start your time. Yeah.
Yeah, step time.
It's a time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what about verses from the Quran that point to some areas of sectors of our life, sectors of human life, which will lead to, which requires obedience, and then that obedience is to lead to success, to victory, and other things, other achievement. Now, in same surah, it looks like Surah An-Nisa, there are a lot of verses, referring to this acts of obedience, obeying Allah and Messenger. Yeah. So Surah, the chapter 4, verse 13. The verse, of course, this is verse by itself, but I will explain. I'll tell you that the context, has to be identified with the preceding verses. But That verse itself, the translation is, those are limits set by Allah. Hudud is referring to hudud Allah, limits of Allah. Those who obey, and please try to not to think of this hudud in the sense understood by some people, okay? Hudud in the sense of limits. The general meaning of hudud means limits. Those are limits set by God. Those who obey God and His Messenger will be admitted to gardens with rivers flowing beneath, to abide therein forever, and that will be the supreme achievement. Supreme achievement. Supreme achievement. Now, of course, the question now, if we refer to the Quran, we know, we can refer to the previous verse, then we know what those limits are. The limits meant by that verse, the limits set by Allah. The limits, of course, refer to the one mentioned in verse 12, one verse before that, which is on inheritance. Verse 11 and 12. Verses 11 and 12, very long verses. Both verses refer to inheritance. So in other words, God has defined the limits of laws of inheritance. How should inheritance be divided among those who inherit their property, among relatives and so on? The Quran is very, very detailed on that. It's very detailed insofar as the ratio, the proportion of the beneficiaries of a particular inheritance. And the Quran says these are limits set by God. If we follow those limits, then supreme achievement in the form of gardens with rivers flowing beneath, to abide therein forever, that will await us. So what I'm trying to say is that in the Quran, example is provided in which obedience, in other words, this obedience is maybe realized in so many different areas of life. It is also channeled just now, but it is in terms of obedience, that's it. And another verse in the context of usury, riba, all right? It's about the limits set by Allah, and we are asked to obey Allah and His Messenger. Now, another one is from chapter 24, verse 54. Chapter 24, An-Nur, the light, chapter on the light, verse 54. Translation: say, obey Allah and obey the Messenger. But if you turn away, He's only responsible for the duty placed on Him, and you for that placed on you. If you obey Him, you shall be on right guidance. Right guidance here is the achievement, or rather is the result that is waiting for us. Of course, right guidance, to be on right guidance is a very, very important thing, especially from the Islamic perspective. So the messenger's duty is only to preach the clear message. Right? So here, basically, obedience to Allah, obedience to the messenger, all right, is for the good. It's for the good of the human individual. Yeah, if you obey God, obey messenger, and then we will be on right guidance. To be on Siratul Mustaqim is our constant prayer. Our constant prayer is that we always be guided on the straight path. Now, interestingly, the verse I mentioned just now, Surah 20, chapter 24, verse 54, what was the verse? Just the preceding verse, 24:53, chapter 24, verse 53. It is important because the two are related, of course. Yeah? Verse 53 is related to verse 54, but verse 53 is an instance of hypocritical obedience. I was talking about in the theory about hypocritical obedience. Then we have here in the Quran one verse that talks about this hypocritical obedience, verse 53. In that verse, the hypocrites, the munafiqun, they swear their strongest oath. They swear their strongest oath that they will forsake their home for the Prophet. That was the swearing. What I wanted to, one of the reasons why I have to refer to this, of course, gives the example of an instance of hypocritical obedience, all right? In the Quran reference to a group of people, the hypocrites, who on small things, they couldn't even follow the Prophet, and now they talk about, they say they are prepared to leave their home, to forsake their home, to follow the Prophet. In other words, and to emphasize that big gap, between the small one and the big one, in a sense, because the big one is the swearing. They swear the strongest oath. The word used in the Quran is jahdu, right? And from the same word, jahada, jahdu. This jahadu referring to the intensity of the swearing. The hypocrites like to swear, but in this particular verse, they swear their strongest oath. You can imagine. In other, they go to the great land to swear. Yes, we support you, the Prophet. They swear. So it is reflected in the word of the Quran, jahdu, meaning the intense, the most intense. Swearing is most intense. Yeah. So in other words, the word jihad and jana, the root word jahada, in other something to emphasize the intensity of the commitment, intensity of commitment. But of course, this is hypocritical. Now, I've given you examples of obedience as a virtue. Now, when does obedience becomes a vice or loss to human human being? This is the forbidden obedience. This is forbidden obedience. And said because obedience, the quality of obedience will be measured in light of the object of obedience. So now this particular, I give you 3 examples when obedience becomes a loss to human being. The first example is chapter 26, verses 152 to 150 to 152. 3 verses, 150, 151, 152. The name of the surah, the name of the chapter is Ash-Shu'ara, the poets. Now, the verses actually quote, basically is a plea. It's a plea from Prophet Saleh to the Thamud people. So this is what Prophet Saleh said in those verses. Quote, but fear God and obey me. Fear God and obey me. And do not follow. La tuti'u. Do not follow. Do not follow. Do not obey the bidding of those who are extravagant. Extravagant, here's translation of al-musrifin. Al-musrifin can be translated as extravagant the wasters, you know, the people who waste, the overspending, okay, the extravagant. Prophet Saleh said to his people, do not follow the bidding of those who are extravagant, who make mischief and cause corruption, yufsidun, in the land, and do not mend or reform their ways. La yuslihun. So this is very profound. This is what the Prophet Saleh said to his people. Said, fear God and obey me. The important thing here is do not obey who? Do not obey those bidding of those who are extravagant and who make mischief and cause corruption. They do not deserve your obedience. And they themselves do not want to mend, to reform their ways. La yuslihun. They do not, they do not reform. La yuslihun. That is the one example from the Quran in the case of legal disobedience. This legal disobedience. Now, the second chapter is from chapter 25, verse 52, chapter Al-Furqan. In English is the criterion, Al-Furqan. And translation, therefore, do not obey the rejectors of faith. I express Al-Kafirun as rejectors of faith because this is not the innocent, unbelievers. No, this is not innocent. This is deliberate rejection of faith. Al-Kafirun, right? So, therefore, do not obey the rejectors of faith, but strive against them. And strive now comes again the word jihad here. Come, jihad, because that's the meaning of jihad, strive. Jahidhum bihi jihadan. That is the difference. Jahidhum bihi jihadan. But strive against them with the utmost strenuousness. Strive against them with the best of strife. The best of striving. What does bihi there is? With the Quran, that refer. Bihi means with the Quran. So therefore do not obey the rejectors of faith, but strive against them with the utmost striving with the Quran. So in other words here, the jihad here, the verse does not say with the sword. In other words, do not obey the rejectors of faith and do not strive against them with the sword, with physical jihad. No, it is not. So here, the rejected, how to deal with these rejectors of faith, how to strive against them with the sword of the Quran. If you still insist on using the word sword, this time it's not okay. It is the sword of knowledge, the sword of knowledge in the Quran, because it is not for nothing that this verse appears in the chapter called Al-Furqan, because Al-Furqan means the criterion of truth and error, the criteria of justice and injustice, right? And therefore here, believers are called upon to deal with these rejectors of faith by means of the Quran itself. As one commentary of the Quran says, the Prophet wages the biggest jihad of all with the weapon of God's revelation, because basically something to do with the field of knowledge. In other words, the rejectors of faith may be using knowledge as well in order to prove that revelation is wrong, revelation is false. All right. So how should we do that? You don't deal with that kind of rejection of faith that is supposed to be based on science and knowledge and so on by the sword. So if that person is a professor, you go and storm the office of the professor and bomb that his office, and so that's not it's not the spirit of this, but strive against them with the Quran, which is the mother of all knowledge, the mother of all wisdom. Now, the third example from chapter 33, verse 48, Surah Al-Ahzab, the Confederates. And in a sense, quite similar, but some different. And this is the translation of the word. And do not obey the rejectors of faith and hypocrites. The only that now, not just to do not obey the rejectors of faith, but also do not obey the hypocrites. And do not heed their annoyances, but put your trust in God, for enough is God as disposer of affairs. To trust in God means not to do nothing, no, to strive, jihad, but put trust in God, that because God is the ultimate disposer of affairs. God will decide for that. So these are the examples. So I think that we sufficient for today for as far as the subject of obedience is concerned. You see the different contexts in which the word obedience is used in the Quran, and some of the, like very important, obedience as a channel of grace, of mercy, and then the different areas of life. For example, in the case of inheritance, where obedience is called upon, is enjoined upon believers. Now let's go to the time that we left to about jihad.
15 minutes.
Sorry?
15 minutes. 15. Yeah.
Okay. The word jihad, of course, is derived from the three-letter root verb, jin ha dal, all right? So we have to have the word jahada, which conveys the meaning to strive, to endeavor, to labor, to take pains, to overwork, all these different shades of meaning of that root verb, all right? So it is a very general meaning in the sense that, in the sense from the meaning itself, you can see that what is meant by jihad, all right, is the whole area of our action, our whole life, but done in a particular way, with different intensity and so on. So the core idea that is sought to be conveyed by the root verb jahada is effort or struggle pursued to the level best. Effort or struggle pursued to the level best. So in that sense, everybody is doing jihad. Not only Muslims are doing jihad. Yeah. So based on this broad and general meaning, everybody is doing jihad because everybody is putting effort in business, putting effort in education, and that's all. That's precisely. So here's some problem, yeah. Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, hello, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. Briefly, yes, shall I cut off? Yeah. Now, yeah, so that is the basic meaning of jihad. And therefore, the application of the jihad is to the whole area of life. And as far as the teaching of Islam concerned, for example, it is perfectly legitimate to speak of jihad in order to pray 5 times a day. That takes jihad. That is to perform jihad, to fast during the month of Ramadan, and to put the extra fasting every on Monday and Thursday. That is a jihad. to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. That's a jihad. So there's a lot of misunderstanding both among Muslims and non-Muslims. It's understandable if non-Muslims understand, but even Muslim, there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what the meaning of jihad is. Of course, there are times, occasions, when physical jihad has to be performed in defense of one's country, one's nation, in defense of a particular cause, a legitimate cause, for the cause of justice and so on. Sometimes that is once in a while. The most of the time is peaceful jihad. It's not physical jihad as described as war. No, it is refers most of the time to other things. Right? The same thing as the word mujahid, the person who does the jihad. Yeah? So mujahid is someone who, yes, the Quran uses the word who fights in the way of Allah, fi sabilillah. So just as obedience has different objects, good object, the real object and false object, so it's jihad. So those who don't believe in God do their own jihad in their own way, in the way of falsehood, not in the way of truth, in the way of justice. Right? So basically, we have a clash between two types of jihad: jihad for the good of everyone, and jihad who those who do evil, who do harm to society. So, in the Quran, 41 times in the root verb, mostly in the third form, the word jihad appears in the Quran, right? So but most of these occurrences of the word jihad in the Quran is in relation to the third form of the word, which precisely means to struggle, to strive, to take pains. Yeah? But what's important in the verses of the Quran, the verses of the Quran refer to the urging to believers to do jihad in the way of Allah, in the way of God, fi sabilillah. So fi sabilillah is what legitimizes jihad. And in the case of the physical jihad, the war into which Muslims have entered, and of course this is not exclusive to Muslims. Every religion has been related to wars, to some wars in its history. Islam is not exception. And what is important here is in Islam, what is emphasized in Islam, and also even in Christianity, the concept of the just war. So even when you have that kind of physical jihad, to fight against an enemy on the battlefield, that jihad has to satisfy, has to fulfill the criterion set by scholars of the Sharia. In other words, in what conditions is jihad permissible? And what is this idea of the just war? But most of the time, it is jihad in our ordinary life to exert our best effort in striving to achieve victory in life. I want to quote you a few hadiths here, which shows that what is the real spirit of jihad. This is striving. The general purpose of this jihad, in the sense of striving, is so that we will always become a better and better individual, doing good for the individual, doing service not only for our own religious community, but for the whole humankind. Right? In other words, jihad is a progress. It's a progression. We can talk about a gradual progress. Doing everyday jihad in numerous aspects of our life, we hope that we will become a better person spiritually and religiously. Now, it is, I'm quoting here two hadith, two prophetic hadith, which in a sense defines the quality of jihad that is sought after. One, Prophet said that the true warrior, mujahid, the person of do jihad, the true warrior, the true person who does jihad, is the one who wages jihad against his own ego, nafs, in obedience to God Almighty. That is very short hadith, but very profound, very profound. This is from Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi and others, right? So the Prophet defines who the true mujahid is, what true jihad is. See, the true one is that person who wages jihad against his own ego, in obedience, of course, to God. Why? Well, there are many explanations for that, because the ego that's referred to here is that lower nafs, the lower ego, right? The passionate ego, the passion, because and the Quran also even mentioned that ego is one of the false idols in our being. Some people worship their own ego, in other words, their own desires. And jihad basically is to go against that tendency of the ego. Right? We must overcome all the passions of the lower ego. Then only we consider ourselves as victorious. So it is this victory in this particular jihad against the nafs, against the ego, that is that's as presented by the Prophet as the greatest. Now, in a sense also related to that, the second hadith, the Prophet said that we have, and this from Badr, from listening from the Battle of Badr, the Prophet told his companions, his followers, we have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. The companions asked, O Messenger of God, what's the greatest jihad? The Messenger said, the struggle, the jihad against the ego. So that's it, that's place again. Yeah. So the fight, the physical jihad, fighting against the enemy on the battlefront, that is a lesser jihad. There's bigger, greater jihad, which is the jihad against the ego. So I think that's is enough to appreciate the spirit of jihad as understood by Islam. But of course, most of the things that are done now in the name of jihad, the violent jihad, the physical jihad, is because it lacks understanding of the whole teaching of Islam. So we have false jihad. When there is a lot of ignorance, then false jihad will become rampant. Of course, in the case of jihad, is also it provides an opportunity for the enemies of Islam to exploit this concept of jihad. So in other words, you can always create your own guru of jihad in order to cause trouble in the name of Islam, but actually has nothing to do with real jihad. So thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Osman Bakar, for a very comprehensive and a very detailed and a deep lecture this afternoon. I cannot summarize everything, but just say that you started by talking about obedience and the different types of obedience, ignorant obedience, hypocritical obedience, and enlightened obedience. And then you went on to discuss about the details of these types of obedience. And then you mentioned several verses from the Quran about obedience. And finally, you talked about jihad as a struggle to perfection, as a progression to something better, and to be it's both in spiritual and religious manner. And you also talked about the hadith. So with this remarks from me, I will say I'll first go to the chat box. We have several questions here. The first question here is that why are the Muslims, I'm summarizing it here from Dr. Rifai, is that why are the Muslims most disobedient people these days?
Well, I'm not sure whether Muslims are the most disobedient, but the point is, yes, there is rampant disobedience. This disobedience can result from many different factors. The most important is ignorance of religion and the misuse of this obedience. In other words, the real meaning of obedience is not explained. So that I already gave 3 examples of obedience. So you have first the what do we call this? The ignorant obedience. Huh? So a lot of young people do follow the instructions of religion, but they don't understand. Many of them, that's due because, why do they do it? Because their elders do it, their parents do it, or their friends do it. So they follow the crowd mentality. So in other words, they don't do that particular act. That is the religion asks of them based on true understanding. But the purpose, this is the purpose of the true purpose of religious education. That's why I posed earlier in my philosophical remarks, right? That's the current method of trying to realize obedience through education will achieve a result. You want, it's good to have discipline, but are we getting the discipline? No. Yeah. Even though every day these children follow religious classes, but at the end of class after class, they are not obedient. So there must be something wrong with the way religion is being taught to our younger children. We need to reform the way we teach our children. It should be based on understanding. Everybody can read the Quran, but do we understand the Quran? We put the teachings of the Quran into practice. This is the main reason. In other words, we listen a lot of things about religion, but we don't really understand what we have learned, or we don't practice what we have learned. So I think if the philosophy that I mentioned just now, if we study address, actually I came up with that because looking at what's going on in our society, all right? Looking at society, we need to address this, especially in the field of education. There's no point having the policy that every day there must be 1 hour of Islamic studies in the class. Yes, during examination, they score, get A grade, but they are like jinn afraid in their behavior, in moral behavior, and so on.
There's a comment by our Buddhist friend, Brother Chi Henpak. He says, "Thank you for listening to this lecture by Professor Osman Bakar. The lecture on obedience has some parallel to the Buddha's teachings about sila or ethical discipline."
Yes, I mean, this is not unique to Islam. Yeah, no religion can exist without obedience, without sense of obedience, without the principle of obedience. Even prophets, yeah. So prophets need obedience from the followers. That's emphasized in the Quran. Spiritual teachers need obedience from their disciples, and Buddhism is a religion. So I'm not surprised at all that there are many parallels on the teachings on obedience between Buddhism and Islam. This obedience is a universal thing. Of course, Islam, apart from sharing those aspects of obedience, teachings on obedience with other religions, it has its own emphasis. Yeah? It has its own emphasis, its own approach. That is the genius of every religion. Islam has its own genius as far as how to invest. So, but the way that things are going, there's something really wrong in the way Islam is being taught.
Yeah. Dr. Rifai is making a comment here, saying that in the name of obedience, the Salafi brothers say we should obey the rulers even if they are bad people, even if they are unjust. This is not what the Quran says, but this is the reality in the Middle East, that people are forced to obey the dictators.
Yeah, I agree. I said earlier that ulil amri minkum, okay, obey those charged with authority. I mentioned that there is always the possibility of being used, abused, misused, and in fact, it has happened. Yeah, for different reasons. Some can be based on ignorance, not having the right understanding. Some based on worldly reason, or for certain things. There are many possible reasons. So, but what is important for those who want to see the culture, the right culture of obedience. Basically, this is what Islam comes to promote a good culture of obedience, the real good culture of obedience, which of course may share similarities with others. So we should ask ourselves, are we really promoting, establishing the Islamic culture of obedience that is based on the correct understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet?
Yeah. So what you're saying is this continued with another comment by Sayyid Jamaluddin Bahrain. He is saying that the media distorts the concept of jihad. Now we're talking about jihad, but they don't highlight the concept of jihad bin nafs. So people think that jihad means just struggle and fighting.
Yes, I think the fault is not only from non-Muslims. You don't expect the non-Muslims to be in this case, because they lack the understanding. But what is bothering is the attitude of Muslims themselves. I know in my own personal life, I come across some friends. I mean, who said that the hadith that I quoted just now? No, I said this is not hadith. No, why? No. Well, if we follow this hadith, then the Muslims will all be afraid to fight. So that is the kind of view that we find in our society. But then we should explain, the reason why. Why is the rationale? What is the wisdom behind that? The fact that the jihad against the nafs, against the ego, the lower ego, is bigger, is greater than the jihad coming back in the battlefield. To me, it can be explained logically, very simple. Yeah, why it is greater? First of all, jihad against the nafs is a 24-hour battle, jihad. Whereas the jihad against the enemy, there's only occasional, sometimes, depending on it. So jihad against nafs is a 24-hour a day jihad. Is a jihad forever. Number two, it is a jihad compulsory on both women and men, on elders and younger. Nobody is an exception. Whereas the Fuqaha will say that for the jihad in the battlefield, some people are exempted from fighting. Yeah. So all these arguments confirm the proposition that fighting against the nafs is the greatest jihad. Cannot be compared to the other, which is so. It is reason. I mean, it is rational also.
Brother Jamaluddin continues and asks the question: is it true that the Mahatma Gandhi, was influenced by the concept of jihad as a peaceful way to fight the British colonial rule?
Can you repeat, Prof?
Yeah, the question is, is it true that Mahatma Gandhi was influenced by the concept of jihad when he met the Muslims in South Africa, and then he developed his own peaceful way or non-violent way of jihad against fighting the colonialists, the British colonialists?
Well, I think it's true. I think it's true. I think Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela were all influenced by, and I mentioned this, Malay Muslims in Cape Town. You know, they all go back to the tradition of the right from the, Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, and later, of course, more important is the Tuan Guru Abdul Salam, Tunku Abdul Salam, who was exiled to South Africa by the Dutch in the 18th century. So his resistance against the Dutch was peaceful, with knowledge, with moral character. This is one of the good things about the Malay diaspora in South Africa. Apart from teaching the Dutch how to be educated, I think yes, it is true. And Dr. Abdul Rahman, who is known in South Africa as the Martin Luther of Africa. All this, I think we should study about these people.
There's a comment by Bibi Jan. Sorry, I just went up. Just a minute. Why don't we have an integrated and balanced way of knowledge, of learning, about Sharia, Aqidah, Tasawwuf, history, Quran, Hadith, in internalizing this knowledge? Why we Muslims don't have this kind of understanding and practice, and we only practice externally?
Well, I don't go into that because there's so many reasons. I mean, there's a long history. What has happened going to the, not only during the post-colonial days, going before the post-colonial days, even before the colonial days. In one of my writings, I mentioned, I refer to the time of Ibn Khaldun, for example. Ibn Khaldun already observed the decline of certain branches of religious knowledge. You understand that there's a long history to that. But the point is, okay, once we know that this situation needs to be corrected, then we should, that's why this now should be part of our new reform education, religious education. In other words, what is the best way to teach Islam to the new generation? What approach, what perspective, what excluded knowledge needs to be brought back, basically. All right, if we say that over the past decades, in the past 1 century or so, certain kinds of useful knowledge has been sidelined, and yet it is important to the betterment of the Muslims, individual and society. So why not? Why not? Let us revive this lost knowledge. I think basically that's what we need to do.
Our sister Parag Michelle Kimball, she tells that today is Martin Luther King Day in the United States because he led the jihad against racism. Do you think Muslims are showing enough courage to stand up for the truth when so many people are being oppressed?
Well, I think we can do more. We can. But I understand also the circumstances and the problems, the challenges. But I think, I mean, I stayed 11 years overseas, and most of the time, in these 11 years in the United States, I think if I compare to the situation 20 years ago to what it is today, certainly there is progress. Yeah, not as much as we expect, but I think there has been progress in the in Muslim civil action, in the United States. In other words, the Muslim community together, yeah, has become more focused, has become more energetic in their jihad, in their own jihad against racism in the America. And I believe that, and certainly I've been saying this before in some of my writing, the importance of American Islam, the importance of Islam in America to the rest of the world, precisely because of the specific situation in which they find themselves. But most important, they are educated people, well-educated people. In other words, they are able, they are capable of bringing about fundamental changes to the war against racism in America, inshallah.
Okay, brother Sayyid Jamaluddin, he says he lives in Sweden. Unfortunately, you mentioned the name of some sheikh who has a spiritual influence on a lot of Malays. Can you tell more about him? You mentioned some sheikhs you mentioned in South Africa who influence the Malays.
Well, I'm telling you, this ISTAC, the organizer of this lecture, a new book is coming up based on one of the seminars that we organized. The seminar was entitled Colonialism in the Malay World, the subtitle Civilizational Virtues. But this book, we call it Civilization Encounters, there's one chapter, because one chapter was given to South Africa. The precisely the Tuan Guru Abdul Salam, whom I call a Malay hero at Cape Town, you know. But there's a book also by this Yusuf Makassar, maybe some South African friends can predict. It's about the life and struggle of Yusuf Makassar against Dutch colonialism. Yeah? But the point is spiritual, the Islamic spirituality was accorded a very special position among the Malay community in South Africa, in the sense that there are many Sufi sheikh coming from the Malay Cape community in the last 1-2 centuries. And it's very wonderful. So I think people in the minorities in other countries can learn from the Malay Capes as far as now how they deal with the challenges of the effect of the Muslim community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a question.
You can see here. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, yeah. There's a question. One argument which tends to lower the position of the hadith of jihad bin nafs is to say that it is a weak hadith. Is this true? What verse in the Quran that strongly puts forward this real meaning of jihad bin nafs?
Well, there are many verses, and this is jihad bin nafs, and in the sense that say the Surah Al-Saf, this chapter 61, Surah Al-Saf, the array. You have this verb, shall I lead you to a way? Hal adlukum ala tijaratin tunjikum min adabin alim tu'minuna billahi wa rasulihi wa tujahidu fi sabilillahi bi amrikum wa anfusikum. You fight in the way of God with your property, with your soul and nafs, right? So in other words, we strive to the utmost, for the sake of truth, in the cause of truth and justice. In the cause of truth and justice. That is what characterizes the Islamic jihad.
Okay, we have 15 more minutes. I have finished the questions from the from the chat box. But if any of the participants here want to ask a question, please go ahead. You can just ask us to unmute you, and we will let you ask a question. Anybody from the audience? Anybody? I don't see anyone saying. Okay, I unmute you all. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, I am from Dhaka in Bangladesh.
Your name, please.
Anisha, I love you. Anisha, hug.
Kausar Mustafa Abdullahi. I am a professor of philosophy, University of
You
Dhaka.
fucking nigger, Islam is
Director
One by
terrorist.
one,
You
please. One by
Center
one,
for
please.
Moral
Anisha,
Development,
Wait.
Anisha, I
University of
love you.
Dhaka. It
Anisha,
is
hug.
definitely very
Yes,
interesting that Professor Bakar, I
yes, Dr.
must
Shah.
congratulate. I really enjoyed. For the first time I am attending your program. I mostly I agree with your observations. Very nice observation on obedience and jihad. Many things I'd like to start with jihad. Jihad with nafs. That is, in my observation, the whole Quran is jihad with nafs. The whole purpose is just to make human being a perfect man.
Wait, one
That
by
is,
one, please.
the thing, whole Quran, the main message of the Quran is to make a man.
May I talk?
Wait a minute.
To make a human being a
Anisha,
perfect
you
man,
can
that
talk.
is
You are my
Khalifa.
girlfriend. Anisha, you
That is
talk.
the whole
These
purpose of the
Muslim are
Quran is to
terrorists.
make vicegerent
Anisha,
of
I love
Allah
you.
on earth. So that
Anisha,
is,
hug. I love you.
without jihad fi nafs, that is simply impossible to become a vicegerent of Allah. So you have to perpetually strive for this thing.
Okay.
And about war and others, in my observation, that is, even the philosophy of war, Islamic philosophy of war, even the Gita is a philosophy of war. Krishna is advising Arjun to fight against evil forces.
Okay,
So
Dr.
this is not
Shah.
only in Islam. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Osman, can you answer that?
Yes. I don't. Yes. And another important point is obedience, enlightened obedience. You have mentioned that is very interesting. But we have to enlighten people. Otherwise, in philosophy, those who believers are termed as unenlightened people, because they consider, the atheists consider that we believer are unenlightened. We are not enlightened.
Okay.
So to make things convincing, you have to present things in such a way that that is, we are enlightened. The believers are enlightened. That should be the approach.
Thank you.
I don't have much space to say
Yeah.
much more things. So thank you all. Thank
Okay. I saw Anissa. Anissa first. Can Anissa go first? She was asking a question.
Assalamualaikum and hi everyone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Firstly, someone in this meet sent me "I love you" suddenly, and I want you to know that please leave this meet if your intention to be here is wrong. I don't gonna mention your name, brother. How you want to do changes to the world when you can't even control your desire to me? Okay, and my question is, first and foremost, thank you, Professor. I really adore your talk about jihad. It is really upon my mind because as a woman, it's not easy for me to jihad with my physical. And since you said that the greater jihad is when my jihad towards, sorry, I'm shaking because, you know, a stranger sent to me, "I love you" suddenly.
Oh my God. This very impolite behavior of
Yeah,
somebody.
impolite.
Yes.
But I can stand for myself, no worries.
Okay.
Because I'm a law student, I will sue you one day, brother.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
My question is, it is not easy to be static on the road of jihad, and I want to know what and how to make ourselves to always be istiqamah, in doing something great in life, in fighting the obedience towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to gain good deeds, because the first jihad is the jihad between ourselves. I believe on that. I believe that the first jihad is between ourselves and our own self-practice and ibadah. What do you think, Professor? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Osman, please. Professor Osman. I don't see him. Professor Osman, are you there?
Please unmute, Prof.
Huh?
Okay.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you?
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Well, basically, how can we move from what we do today to what is going to be better and better in the future days ahead. Huh? So I think, first of all, there's the jihad that we can do at the individual level. As an individual, we do our own jihad. But more important in the context of the present time is collective jihad. Precisely because the challenges that we are facing are not coming from single individuals, in the sense that who are those who are challenging religion or fighting against religion, they themselves getting organized in a collective way. So if I may say this, if the munkar is better organized, then what about those who are fighting for the ma'ruf? Yeah. So if munkar is getting better organized, so the ma'ruf also, in fact, is to be better organized. That is the nature of the society we have seen today. All right, where the individual, okay, I mean, we can talk about our jihad in prayer. We want to make sure that if we haven't prayed this tahajjud, this I want to do tahajjud now, and then there's a personal effort on our part. But as far as the Muslim community is concerned, there are many challenges that have to be faced collectively, and therefore you have to get together with your neighbors, your companions, your friends, and then of course the manner, the way that we do it should be better organized. The quality of our jihad. After all, what is the basic meaning of jihad? To strive to the utmost in the best possible manner. All right. As the Quran in Surah As-Saf, that we fight as if we are in the well. In an array, but in front line to do our jihad. Yeah.
I'm going to unmute Idris Zakaria. Sharon, please unmute Idris.
What was the question, Idris Zakaria, just now?
Yeah, she's going to ask her herself. Brother Shara, please unmute Idris Zakaria.
No,
Shahran. I'm asking Shahran to unmute Idris Zakaria.
There's a thing, Brother Aris Suban once.
Sharat, can you?
Yeah. Okay, but Idris, unmute yourself.
Okay. Idris, unmute yourself, please. Okay, while we wait for others, I think she's not ready yet. Anybody else want to ask a question? Yeah, Arif, unmute yourself, Arif. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Arif.
Hello, Assalamualaikum.
Yeah, walaikum salam. Go ahead, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much to the organizers for having this talk. Thank you to Professor Imtiaz, Professor Osman Bakar. It's nice to see everyone. It's been quite a while. Right. My question is with regards to freedom, because this whole notion of freedom in the Western world is kind of limited to the individual sense. You know, when we talk about freedom, we are talking about liberties that might come with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and so forth. But how do we actually conceptualize jihad and obedience and make it relevant in the Western world so as to have this concept of jihad to not be misconstrued by the Western world? Because more often than not, it is seen as a struggle against others as opposed to struggle against the self. I know, Prof. Osman, you have pointed out very comprehensively of what jihad really means in Islam. But how do we actually conceptualize this so as to actually, not defend Islam, but talk about jihad in a way that can be understood by the West? Thank you.
Well, I said jihad in its general meaning, covers all aspects of our life. Even Muslims actually are doing a lot of jihad, and a lot of Westerners. Let's say, for example, the philanthropists, or rather, those with charity. Let's say those with charity, the charity groups in the West, where of course most of them based on religion, but there are also non-religious charitable groups. So it's a very important aspect, I would say, of jihad, universal jihad. So in every religion, in every community, there are people who do this. That is a form of jihad. But the Sharia is more, of course, again, we shouldn't be afraid to make comparison, all right? The question now, yes, it is good to be charitable, but in terms of priorities, who should receive this charity? This is where the Sharia will come in, all right? We give their point of view. Yes, they don't have to follow, but it is our part, it is the role of Muslim, all right? We share the value of charity, but on details, maybe we differ. So there are many things that good things that are being done by people in the West, which can be discussed in the context of jihad. But of course, it's important. Jihad in whose path, in whose way, in the sense that the final objectives of this jihad is what? And this is where Islam cannot compromise. In the West, jihad that is not done in the way that, in the sense, the promise of good, the common good, and that is universal, of course. Right? So the Quran speaks about what are the criterions of the best community, the best society. Khairu ummatin ukhrijat linnas, right? In sense, ta'muruna bil ma'ruf. You encourage the good. The Quran is very universal there. Encourage the good, right? The good may be pursued in the context of the West with certain goals in mind, but in Islam, we think that we have broader goals. Yeah, in other words, it's not just for the benefits of this world, in this life, in this world, but also in the hereafter. In other words, the quality of our ma'ruf. That's why they actually, the verse explains that what tumiruna bil ma'ruf, what tamruna bil ma'ruf, wa tanhauna 'anil munkar. So Muslims and non-Muslims do ma'ruf, encourage the good. They also prevent some evil. Not every evil, not every munkar they do, but they do some of them. For example, some communist countries used to ban gambling, for example. Yeah, so they ban gambling. They are not Muslim. They ban gambling. All right. But then the third criteria is very important in distinguishing between Muslim and non-Muslim. Wa tu'minuna billah. Yeah. So even atheist society, they promote good. Theist society also do prohibit munkar the way Muslims, but they don't believe in God. So that criteria is very, very important. Does make the difference.
Okay, we have gone for 2 hours now. So this is going to be the last question. Sayyid Jamaluddin Barahang, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Professor Osman, Professor Imtiaz, Ustaz Shahran, thank you so much, all great organizers. I feel like I want to move to Malaysia, Indonesia. It's such a great things happening there that is so beneficial for our Ummah. Jazakallah khair for your great work. Professor Osman, thank you so much for your terrific talk and also for all the great work you do. It's so beneficial for us to recite you in many of your work. And what you're doing is certainly giving so much for all of the Muslims. So thank you so much. I just wonder, Professor, a reflection regarding the brother before, he also mentioned it regarding the situation in West. And I'm particularly interested in your perspective. I know that we as Muslims need to work with ourselves, all close. We need to be good representatives and ambassadors of our deen. This is the first and foremost. I totally agree with you. But we also have forces like in France, you know, right now with the politics going on there, like here in Sweden, in the whole West, where there are both with the Islamophobia, but also with how the media indirectly is distorting some of our concepts, like jihad, for instance. This is very interesting, Professor. Like when you read the magazines, and there is research on this, you know, they translate all the Arabic words when they are interviewing some Muslim, besides the word jihad. They never translate it to English. So people don't know what jihad is, even in English. So they think that jihad is connected to something that is not part of our deen. And this is actually something that has been going on for many, many years. They never, and I actually spoke with some journalists because I used to work within media, and I asked them, like, every time you interview Muslims, you never translate the Arabic words to English or Swedish, because this creates mystification. You know, Professor Osman, about mystification, like, oh, what is this word, this mystic word, and they don't know what the So my question for you, Professor Osman, do you have any advice? Of course, we need to work with ourselves and become better ambassadors, but other advice, how can we make non-Muslims have a better perspective and also to be handling these things in a better way? I have like a friend, his name is Jihad. He changed his name here in Sweden because he cannot be named Jihad anymore. People think that he is, by definition, is a bad person. Jazakallah khair, Professor Osman.
Well, your question, there are many different ways that can be done. And of course, first thing to bear in mind is that the condition, the context in each country is different. Well, France is in Europe, and Sweden in Europe, but Sweden has its own different social context. So even the Western, even among the European countries, there are different situations. Some maybe more difficult, more challenging. And so I understand that in the Scandinavian countries, there are certain things that may be considered as a plus. As a plus for some Muslim minorities. So you know better your own condition. What is important is, in other words, I think to be, in a sense, I believe that the Islamic movement, the way the prophets led his followers. In Mecca, for example, because in Mecca they were not yet an organized community, but still we can learn something, because I believe that God has also not only revealed what Islam is, but also guided on how Islam needs to be explained, to be presented to the local community. But not to be too worried, by the fact that, of course, there will be some people who, because of their own misunderstanding, ignorance, they should hostility or something. But there's always be a few, at least a few good people to whom we should approach. look for communities, look for those groups in your local community, in your country, and looking for people with the same kind of vision, the same kind of society that they want to create, the kind of, and this is best through dialogue. To me, we should develop a dialogue culture which take into cognizance of the specific condition in an area. And of course, that requires wisdom. I observe that there is a lack of wisdom. Sorry to say that there's a lack of wisdom among Muslim groups living as minorities. They behave as if they live as majorities. Yeah? Be conscious of the fact that you are minorities. And I think Islam does deal also with the question of kind of these teachings on recommendations, advice on how to live as a minority. Just now I quoted that verse, all right? Do the jihad with the Quran. Strive your jihad with the Quran. Right? We don't mention jihad here, but a lot of misunderstanding. But the point is that in order to create that bond, that bridge between with the other, right? In order to create that bridge between the Muslim community and the rest, we have to be wise in choosing the issues that we need to talk about. I'm sure there will always be students, academics, social workers who will share the same position, the same attitudes and sentiment. And from there, we expand and develop. So always bearing in mind that Islam speaks from the universal perspective. Islam is inclusive. Right? The principle of Tawheed is beautiful because it's a very, very inclusive principle. Those who are looking for ideas, those who are looking for theories, those looking for answers to contemporary problem, then the universal dimension of Islam needs to be presented. So our job is to identify what are the universal elements, what is universal dimension of Islam that needs to be presented to the European community at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going more than 2 hours now. So I will stop our meeting here this afternoon. So thank you very much and thank you especially to Professor Osman Bakar for his enlightening lecture. Every lecture is deep, philosophical, and educative to all of us. So thank you, Professor Osman. Inshallah, we'll see you again and wish you all the best. And thank you for all the participants. And we will continue with our 4th lecture, and we will advertise it when the time comes for it. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Welcome, salam. Okay.